We're live. You see?
All right.
Happy to save the day.
Yeah, I'm very glad you did.
Okay, can you the closed caption thing? I think it's that I think so way more.
Okay.
Yeah. So I like set up my own.
I think that's unless you know how to do it.
It's okay.
Okay. All right. So I'm just gonna have it be ready.
Yeah, keep it up. Hello. I don't want to use my teacher voice. Good morning again, everyone. Thanks for Power Notes again for sponsoring this brunch and for giving that presentation on AI tools. And now it's my privilege and honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. David Green. David F. Green Jr. is an associate professor of English specializing in African American literature, language, and rhetoric, and composition studies. He earned his PhD in English from Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Green's teaching and research focuses on theories of writing and linguistic justice, as well as examines the verbal traditions of African Americans expressed through literature, hip hop, and Black popular culture. He has published and edited a collection of essays, visions, and ciphers, explorations of literacy discourse, and Black writing experiences in 2016. He has published widely in journals and collections such as Changing English, College Language Association Journal, and celebrating 20 years of Black girlhood, the Lauryn Hill Readers. He is currently the secretary of the Conference on College Composition and Communication and a past facilitator of the Modern Language Association Summer Institute on Reading and Writing. Dr. Green has a deep respect for the role of the humanities in understanding and supporting community engagement, as well as the role of language and literature in supporting social justice work. And as you can see, the title of his presentation, of his keynote on the screen, please welcome our keynote, Dr. David Green.
Thank you. So hopefully I can keep it a little funky with you today. But also I want to explore a little bit as we think about social justice work regarding writing program administration. I wanted to explore, not just what we read, but how we read, what our expectations of, but also how we think about those voices from the past that shape how we read and shape how we think about how we read. So thank you, and I appreciate the invitation here today. Given all that is happening nationally, all that is happening internationally, all that is happening professionally, all that is happening personally, all that is happening spiritually. I hope to do a few things with this discussion. Part of my main goal is to explore the relevance of cultural writing traditions to the ways we think about disadvantage and racial injury in our work as writing program administrators, and to the ways we reimagine our work as teachers of writing for responding to an always evolving view of language and writing and culture. Culture is itself a resource which connects communities and the language traditions of those communities with its members. Thus, culture and cultural writing provides an important source of knowledge about the ethics, the histories, the traditions that comprise what we consider to be writing, how we define writing, and so on and so forth. Additionally, because of culture's importance to how I think about the Black writing tradition, I want to use this time to explore storytelling as a resource for contemplative thought on the work that we do as administrators. I want to also use this time to discuss hip hop as a cultural rhetoric important to the ways we conceptualize writing beyond simply the teaching of putting words to a page. From my perspective, a Black writing tradition provides a powerful resource for complicating and expanding our understanding of harm and injury. When I think about the African American art of storytelling, I cannot help but think about hip hop music and about the ways that songs of that genre tell a story. Songs such as the often cited A Children's Story by the rapper Slick Rick, or the famous The Art of Storytelling series by the rap group Outkast. And the ways that these stories highlight the potential for reflection and possibilities embedded in these songs. As writing teachers, things we tend to encourage among our students tends to focus not simply on storytelling, but focuses on how we define critical reflection, critical thought. But how do we begin to take into account some of the vast varieties of literacies that students have to engage in order to begin to think about their own resonant voices? What I appreciate about hip hop storytelling, in some ways, the stories that are told through a creative chorus of coded metaphors, and in other ways, the stories that are simply narrated because of the complex experiences that they render for each audience. I tend to think about Kendrick Lamar's first commercially released album, Good Kid, Mad City, for example, which blew me away for his ability to weave such a narrative coherence about the struggle that followed the emotional highs and lows of John Singleton's Boys in the Hood. Lamar's ability to weave multiple stories into a larger story about grief at such a young age was in fact so powerful for me. An album that has more recently caught my attention in a similar manner, but not for its storytelling, but for its complex practice of critique, is Black Star's No Fear of Time. There is a literary depth in the album's message and the interconnected messages of each song. The album, at its most authentic, asks its audience to consider how listeners measure the strength of one's voice across time and what traditionally artfully informs one's legacy. Reminiscent of older Dungeness sounds of 90s underground hip-hop music, the album No Fear of Time attempts to remind listeners of this group's place within the broader history of hip-hop and Black music traditions. Songs such as OG, Sweetheart, Sweet Tide, and the title track No Fear of Time highlight some of the group's overt concern with their legacy, while also making a statement about the need for re-remembering that often shapes how we understand legacies. The artists and the album have taken on a fair amount of criticism for choosing this pathway with regards to their second album, released in almost 2.5 decades. Right? So Black Star is really, really dope underground hip hop duo, if you're unfamiliar. It involves Mos Def, also known as Yasin Bey, and Talib Kweli, son of English professor Brenda Green. And they formed this, really dope group, and they dropped their first album, Black Star, in the late 90s. And then they went on to individual projects, so on and so forth. And then they hadn't dropped an album for 25 years almost, right? So there's a lot of expectation around that, was what I'm trying to say, what I'm trying to set up. And what was given was a bit different than what people expected. So the album at its most authentic asks its audience to consider both how listeners measure the strength of one's voice across time and what kinds of traditions artfully informs one's legacy. Reminiscent of older Dungeness 90s underground hip hop music, No Fear of Time attempts to remind listeners of this group's place within the broader hip hop and Black music traditions. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. So as I listened to the album and after its initial release last year, I can remember being startled and but really not surprised by the appearance of the late and brilliant music critic Greg Tate's voice at the close of the album. Tate's passing in the late 2021 was a blow to readers and fans of his work, such as myself. The fact that his voice concludes the album only further pressed for me that the urgency of Black Star's request for deep listening and deep listeners was palpable and present throughout the entire album. Tate's voice is digitally manipulated as he talks about the relevance of hip hop and Black music culture. The album ends with Tate repeating the phrase phenomenal memory, phenomenal memory, phenomenal memory, as his voice trails off. The use of Tate's words and memory in this way is not unlike Outkast's use of Rosa Parks' the use of Rosa Parks decades earlier, nor Kendrick Lamar's use of the digitally manipulated voice of Tupac at the end of his album To Pimp a Butterfly. All three instances articulate a type of troubled eloquence reminiscent of Cheryl Wall's insights about the African American essay tradition. As Wall writes in her beautifully written study of the African American essay on freedom and the will to adorn, the need for an eloquence with language that understands the position of the status quo and the need to turn from the status quo in an effort to construct new paths at any specific moment. The troubled in this sense represents tension and discomfort, but also a means of looking forward. A troubled eloquence, to state it differently, is the difference between appealing to one's humanity to advocate for freeing slaves or simply advocating for the recognition of one's right as a citizen worthy of freedom by the legal right of their humanity. Troubled eloquence assumes recognition and challenges the status quo as necessary. Wall borrows this term from writer Nathaniel Mackey, and as she notes, it is a term meant to identify the insufficiency of particular forms of language, including academic language, for describing injustice at a particular given moment. The phrase snitches get stitches comes to mind when I think about troubled eloquence. But also the phrase defund the police, which circulated loudly during the pandemic, functions as a type of troubled eloquence for me. The phrases attempt to capture something larger than the simplicity of the statement or the request. And instead, the phrases highlight the tension built into different histories of mistreatment by police officers and branches of police systems. When placed into the service of thinking about justice, the idea of troubled eloquence is needed as a way of recognizing the larger legacies that shape the conditions for one's recognition or one's erasure. I am reminded of Toni Morrison's story about her great-grandmother in her short book of criticism, Origin of Others. In the story, Morrison notes that she and her sister had been tampered with. Morrison notes that her great-grandmother looks at her and her sister and notes that they have been tampered with. As she explains, the phrase itself had an exotic appeal at first, until it became clear that tampered with meant something less than pure. It was a phrase meant to capture the legacy of the rape of an enslaved people, and it was meant to signal Black purity as a laudable goal, and her great-grandmother and her great-grandchildren's lacking in that particular area. Nevertheless, what Morrison provides is an understanding of how early one can come into contact with any form of linguistic violence. As she notes, the process of othering that can occur linguistically is a type of romancing of the language. Or, in other words, the strategic use of language to suggest a particular concept, behavior, or explanation is acceptable or even humane when we know obviously otherwise. For Morrison, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin is a text that renders the inhumanity of slavery as humane and acceptable, in this way romancing the notion of slavery. In a similar line of thinking, one can see the recent Supreme Court judgments against affirmative action as a type of romancing of inequality and colorblindness, right? And so this is not a critique necessarily of the judgments in and of themselves, right? I don't think we ever get to true arguments about the merits of affirmative action, part of what I'm trying to note. Instead, what we get is this kind of language that allows us to flip or turn our understanding of a particular concept and its goals or its purpose. In this case, the idea of affirming a group of people or a collection of folks value to be in spaces that traditionally were traditionally did not want them, traditionally did not create space for them. So the work to preserve the idea of legacy admissions while also denying consideration of race as a detriment to merit highlights the various ways the idea of merit itself can be caressed or reshaped to be in opposition to long histories of racial injustice. Still, little conversation about the ruling addresses whether there was an actual imbalance in access based on merit. Was this actually occurring? And instead assumes a type of racial injury on the part of students who feel entitled to a particular kind of access to an Ivy League education and assume a certain intellectual inferiority of Black peers. And this is part of it comes from thinking about, the previous challenge, right? The Abigail Fisher, right? The euphemistically known Becky with the bad grades, in part because it comes out when you actually, take time to look, right? One, she had worse grades than several people who didn't also get into to that respective university. But at the same time, it wasn't even close, right? In terms of the amounts of African-American students that were let in who were less qualified, if we're going to use that troubled language. And so what is frustrating, I think, is that one, there's a lack of memory, but also this kind of romancing of language that Morrison points out is at the source, of how we might trouble our own eloquence. So, according to Judith Butler, what is being romanced, though, is not necessarily merit, but a selective reading of merit as privileged access earned through narrow assumptions about learning and a selection process. This romancing privileges a kind of individualism that is formed by denying one's reliance on dependency, right? So part of her argument is that we're actually folks who need each other, surprise, surprise, for resources, for knowledge, to get things done. But certain systems are in place that position us as having to assume a certain rugged individualism as a posture and ethos to manage through the system. In her book, The Force of Nonviolence, Butler notes that concepts such as inequality or injustice are shaped by the denial of interdependency. For Butler, inequality can be thought of as an overexposure to harm due to the ways that resources or processes or structures are denied to particular groups. Without reliance on others to provide services or aid in some way, vulnerability increases in our allegiance to independence, and individualism can become debilitating. The keeping of legacy admissions highlights the flaw in reasoning regarding race and merit. If consideration of race creates an imbalance, should not consideration of one's heritage create a similar imbalance? What Butler provides is that when what may be use in this instance for thinking about particular writing traditions, also notions of fairness and justice, is a reconsideration of policy or what we mean when we talk about policies. As she notes, policies serve as a form of social recognition first around the ways we value or understand, right, our collectivity, our need for each other, and so on and so forth. And I thought that was particularly powerful kind of point, which is that when we make decisions about what gets included in a particular curriculum or how students are allowed to manage either claims of dishonesty or how students are allowed to manage particular moments of struggle, is largely dependent on our ability to recognize or have a certain recognition of humanity first, and then what's possible second. Policies are often designed to consider larger threats to a system or group. Thus, policies in theory provide procedures for thinking about, say, harassment or assault with greater consideration for the threat that these concepts pose to a work environment, notice that language, or a threat to the merit of a student's grade, right? And so the threat is a kind of threat of violence because it disrupts the system of how we're able to measure, students' accuracy. So if a student can harass a teacher and get an A, this throws the system into whack, and this might be cause for a particular kind of response. Again, it comes back to how do we value and recognize people as people, and how do we make decisions based on that understanding first. Thus, policies can be used to recognize or erase, to affirm or deny, and it is largely a matter of how conditions are structured, which will make one more or less vulnerable in any given situation. For Farrar Jasmine Griffin, struggles with the concept of merit and mercy highlight the complex vulnerability that has always been an experience of African American life. One's worthiness, or what could be defined as merit, is something defined by a white power structure for the benefit of white power structure in the eyes of Griffin. The concept of mercy, however, provides a form of troubled eloquence, one necessary for understanding how Black writers and Black writing function. Mercy for Griffin is the willingness to forgive that which should be punished. Mercy in this instance is only something that can be granted a victim who has been injured. In African American writing, the act of mercy remains an ambivalent endeavor because in some instances, mercy is an act of granting forgiveness to make peace for oneself. At other times, mercy is about reclaiming recognition of one's humanity by recognizing the ways that one has been harmed and having that harm recognized equally. Recently, I've had the chance to work with a number of esteemed colleagues thinking about the future of writing instruction, given the rise of AI writing platforms as a part of a dedicated task force to studying this area. While many instructors remain wary of what such technologies can do to particular definitions of writing, others have noted how this moment mimics past moments of crises around writing and literacy studies. I'm still not quite sure where I land on this. I was never one to entertain why Johnny can't read, write, think, and so on, etc. Dog whistle reporting that has been known to occur historically throughout our profession. And instead, I've always been more interested in how the dopeness of Johnny's pen game and language skills could often go undernoticed or undervalued. David Kirkland provides a rather in-depth exploration of this phenomenon in the studying of young Black boys in his monograph, Search Past Silence. In his study of 4 boys and their in and out of school literacy experiences, Kirkland highlights the outsized roles that hip-hop music and the vernacular practice of rap play in the young boys' lives. What Kirkland exposes in his study is the lack of dopeness associated with writing and the types of emotional violence that still too often can occur within writing instruction spaces. Like many other young men, their hip-hop writing is undervalued and seen as unserious and separate from school writing. The boys are viewed as undisciplined based on their struggles to find a common ground on the purpose of writing and language classes. I have 3 questions I want us to consider in lieu of this. How do we as writing administrators use policies to recognize the humanity of the voices that are composing in our very classrooms? How does this lack of recognition work to privilege academic writing instead of other kinds of writing that are also useful? Does recognition add fairness in writing instruction? As Jacqueline Royster notes in Academic Discourses or Small Boats on a Big Sea, writing is a people-centered enterprise, one that requires a curiosity about the systems of power, controlling and privileging certain dispositions toward language and certain assumptions about authority. As she also notes, this requires deep consideration of the ways that we are not all in the same boat, which is not necessarily a metaphor about privilege, although it does not go unnoticed. It is in itself a reflection on the constructs that are developed to navigate the wide seas of discourse, whether academic, professional, or social. We all have choices in how we represent ourselves, our values, and our stances toward the vulnerable and the unjust through language and symbols. And it is through our interrogation of cultures, languages, and ourselves that the interwoven nature of concepts such as disadvantage and fairness are made clearer for language users, just as the role of language innovation is made clearer or can be made clearer as well. I want to pivot this discussion to another story before I begin to work myself to a conclusion. Storytelling, for me in this instance, represents a moment to remember voices that have been important to me across time and as a way of thinking about what lays ahead for the social justice work of writing teachers. And so bear with me. I'm going to take a little creative turn here. And perhaps it was, my rereading of Robin D.G. Kelly's edition of 25th anniversary edition of Freedom Dreams that kind of influenced this, right? But I wanted you to walk with me into the future for a moment. So I recently fell asleep and woke up in the year 2045. Disoriented, I can remember noticing the calendar in the front office and a young African-American brother telling me, "This way, Doc, I want to show you around my classroom." "What class is this?" I replied sheepishly. "My memory and hip-hop social justice writing class is the second writing requirement for students in the Emancipatory Writing Division of the Honors College. American hip-hop has become such an older and niche music form, but it remains such an important foundation for understanding contemporary theories about combinatory writing and inequity. The students mostly listen to global trap music and sometimes neo-hip-hop jazz trap now, but rarely do they get the time to explore culture through music that is a strong foundation of theirs. A few go on to become digital griots in their own right, working in independent institutes of knowledge and progression, but most simply learn to appreciate learning how previous generations studied writing through music and other forms of discourse." This was a mouthful. I had to figure out what to say very quickly. I hushed and simply followed the young man to the classroom. As I walked into the classroom, I noticed a remixed and spliced version of Adam Banks' 2015 Four C's Chairs address. The beat from Notorious B.I.G.'s Juicy with the heavier bass and his repeating voice of "If you don't know, now you know," played over a contorted Banks dancing to Bootsy Collins' "I'd Rather Be With You," and interjected with the need for and his interjections, repeated interjections, of a need for a new dominant writing paradigm and to retire the 5-paragraph essay as the dominant paradigm for writing. The students were all working on small group projects of some sort. Some were studying old mixtapes and pairing them with computer-generated responses to queries that they made up about the top 5 works on composition studies in the 1980s. Another group did this with the top 10 works on race and composition in the 90s, and still a third group in the corner did this with gangster rap in the 90s. I asked the young teacher how often students use the AI platform ChatNow Brown Cow to compose their seminar papers. He turned with a smile and noted most students simply use them to generate oppositional readings and sample readings before heading into the later stages of mixing and flow, and then the peer reader colloquiums that occur at the end of the semester. The most difficult part of teaching writing these days is helping students to see how their range of voices might benefit them beyond their professional interests one day. I chuckled. Many of them are already planning how to monetize their writing even before they make it to year 3 into the language laboratories that are awaiting them. I clearly had more questions than answers. I studied the oversized classroom. I was confused. I wanted to know more. The young professor with the wry smile studied my face and asked if I was dream hopping. I was startled but replied, "Likely so. Does this happen often?" "Not too often," he noted. He then mentioned that much of his own dissertation was a synthesis of the different theories on vulnerability and trauma in the study of social justice writings during the third great culture wars of the 2020s. Tentatively, he asked, what were writing program administrators feeling and thinking about the repression of affirmative action as an ideal? Or were the students still experiencing PTSD from managing the COVID plagues of the early 2020s? I got another question, Dr. Green. How did folks decide that social justice work was vital to writing studies at a programmatic level? Was there a big speech in a conference ballroom, or was it a response to all of the conservative Supreme Court rulings? Unsure of what to say and unsure how to respond, I simply nodded, wanting to know more from him as he did one from me, and watching them slowly fade as I closed my eyes. I awoke and couldn't help but think of Cedric Robinson's terms of order and what it suggests for how we might think about justice for ourselves in this moment. As he notes, justice is more than creating policies or procedures to govern our bias. It is a critical act of interpretive blending aimed at disrupting cemented beliefs about who is worthy and who is unworthy, based on a type of unquestioned allegiance to preserving a status quo. Robinson asks readers to challenge common sense thinking in regards to their civic zealotry and the easy acceptance of specific ideas about order, organization, and authority. As Robinson notes, we are not allowed to question the order of things because that would be anarchy. And yet, that is exactly what is called for at times, right? A disruption of our narrow understanding of the limits of the human condition. We maintain a status quo by asking teachers and students to reduce their view of writing rather than mold it for the future and for the future processes that await them. The last observation I wish to make is an attempt to remember a voice that has been vital to me over time in different ways. In his essay, Wistful Admiring the Rhetoric of Combination, the late composition theorist David Bartholomew explores the rhetoric of sentence combination. For Bartholomew, part of the goal is helping students and teachers to teach the act of association as a critical act. A way of seeing one text through another is the way it is presented in the essay. As always, for Bartholomew, there is a system in place, a hierarchy of rules, which is broken improperly, do more to diminish the possibilities of creative and critical writing. It is a way of approaching writing that is overly concerned with expansion rather than the control of expression. What often captures my eye as a hip-hop head and hip-hop writing scholar is the way Bartholomew notes the progressive promise of combination. That is, for him, writing is the art of surprise cultivated through experimentation and exploration of language, and yet language need not be wholly brand new, only sequenced, processed, and designed in order to explore it further. It is here where memory meets expressive writing and the critical thought of what Bartholomew refers to as the necessity of memorial in his final work, Like What We Imagine. In the title essay of this collection, he asks readers to take a journey with him to his early writing experiences with his writing teacher, David Osborne, and his encounters with Edward Said and T.S. Eliot, but also more importantly, his concern with the ways that we come to know writing only through what has come before us. Writing in this way for him, and in many ways for me, is an act of memorial that is obnoxious, if not rooted in a choice to study what has come before and make choices that are decidedly different or decidedly build off of what has come or what has happened. This passage captures the tension for me best. A scholar heads out with a fixed idea, a thesis, but stumbles on a footnote. And if this is a good scholar, a serious one, everything stops and the project reorganizes itself, and the scholar realizes how unprepared she is for the work that must be done. She has to teach herself to become an autodidact, to read things she is unprepared to read, and to think things she has not yet thought. It is exciting, it is necessary, it is conventional and predictable, and it must be staged. Bartholomew would not be himself if he did not stress the importance of the struggle with language, the struggle with reading, and the reckoning with social systems that wield power over us through their ability to require us to discern and exclude. And yet for me, the danger is in the inability to help students find pleasure in the act of writing or find care in their relationships with language. The overemphasis on academic order places a high value on demonstrating a precise and ordered way of talking about a topic. And yet the advancement of digital technologies asks for more. They ask for us to think about crate digging and other hip hop concepts as a means of remembering. They ask us to think about these concepts as a way of reorienting one's disposition towards language. In many ways, I think it is easier to talk about what students need to do to become critical writers that we hope they become than it is to begin to reflect on the difficult task of reorienting our teaching toward a view of writing that acknowledges the vulgarity of particularly tense moments in music, or to acknowledge history as a collection of moments about growth that can be strengthened through archival connections that require students and teachers to be both curious about the text that they value and about the way that they discuss these things with each other. I'm going to close out here.
Thank you, David, for this powerful speech, and we have time for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please just raise your hand. We'll bring the mic, or I don't think, yeah, it moves. So. People are so quiet.
Do we yell it out? I can do that.
That's why we have to come if you drop it.
Wow, expectation. Hi, thank you so much. So much to think about. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about policy and the role policy could or should not play in how we try to do the work going forward. Because I'm really stuck there right now myself, and I heard you talking about it, and I'm like, ooh, help me. Right? I don't know. So kind of what are some ways we could think about it, like as a heuristic maybe even, or whatever comes to mind. I would love to hear more about that. Thanks, and thank you.
You got me right. So what I thought was really radical about kind of Butler's use of policy and how it made me begin to think was like policies in one sense are rhetorical documents constructed to meet particular needs at particular times, right? This doesn't mean we can just, randomly create things to meet our will in particular, meet our will as we see fit. We still have to diagnose, assess, think through particular problems with some depth. But it was also the point that because policies can be constructed rhetorically in particular ways, it's that we can also make decisions about what we value as we construct those policies, right? So how much do we value students' abilities to gather confidence from their writing experiences? Do we value this over, say, the use of the 5-paragraph essay as the main, way we're going to measure? Or even do we value this in a way in which we're able to say, we want you to play, we want you to think about composing in these different ways. And if they break certain traditional norms, we're willing to see what these things do or how these things can work. And so what policies do in this instance, it forces us to ask certain questions about the human beings that we're interacting with, even as we have to make some of the larger big picture, this doesn't mean things, work out perfectly. But I thought this was the interesting thing is that one, justice, obviously as a lot of things exists on a continuum, right? There's certain degrees of fairness in how we can think about certain things. But asking questions differently, bringing different voices into that mix as we begin to do that type of work, right? This was like transformative for me, for my thinking in that way. So I don't know if I'm quite fully answering your question, but all I can say in terms of policy, I thought it is much a cultural, social, professional, functional kind of role within how we think about writing. So that's a slightly different approach than simply moving things along because this is what either was provided or what was done before, or this was certain expectations that folks may have had without consideration of the student bodies that are there, but also the teachers that are there as well. Like what are teachers asking for? What are they thinking about, right? Policy is this weird mix of rhetorical decisions that we have to make and then justify and show. And so I don't know if it's always positioned that way, right? In some ways, it's very kind of functional kind of presentation.
More questions?
Thank you very much for your talk. I was really particularly taken by your move to dream hop to another generation. It made Afrofuturism come to mind, and in Kay Jessel's book, How Long Till Black Future Month. And so my question is, not the how long, but how to get to that classroom. And that's probably far more than we can discuss here, but it is a classroom I'd love to be the instructor in, maybe even the student in, but it just, how do we get there?
Right. And I think, part of the reason I wanted to include that, as I mentioned, is just recent experiences, recent conversations. As we all know, the AI conversation is looming large. But it was an attempt to also meet it with the same sense that we meet other moments of crises, right? It's an understanding and kind of reestablishing of what it is that we value. How might we express these things in ways that meet what students need? And so this idea of combinatory rhetorics, right? This is all a part of how hip hop works. This is how rappers, this is how DJs and producers, these are how dancers begin to compose the body of works that they compose, right? It is taking things from spaces and places that traditionally are not thought to be connected to other spaces and places. It is the connection of different kinds of rappers with complementary styles to create a larger concept in themselves in that way. And so what I'm really saying is that for me has always been, and this is why I end with the Bartholomew piece, it's always been a conversation about combinatory rhetorics and what this means for the heart of how we define writing moving forward. If that is the case, then, even the ChatGPT is going to get subsumed some kind of way into this discourse about writing. If so, can we imagine a possibility in which this is fun, in which it can be fun for students, and in which we can, not just monitor their writing, but again, to provide them with different perspectives about what they should be doing with their writing, right? So adventurousness and playfulness rather than repression. And part of that requires more work on our parts, right? To, educating ourselves, thinking this problem through, at its core. But it's also, taking that imaginative leap too. And to me, that is at the heart of social justice work as well, right? So I'm borrowing from Robert D.G. Kelly's work and Derek Bell's work as well, right? As Asia Martinez talks about counter storytelling and how this works to help us think differently about, in critical race studies, usually about legal cases or legal responses, but in composition study has been more so about possibilities and about how we think about identity. And I'm saying this can also work for how we think about how culture shapes our discussions of writing, right? So we're always processing these things, but it's often sometimes more work to try to fit them in kind of finite categories rather than rethink the categories themselves.
More questions? Okay, so please, one more round of applause for Dr. Rereading. And it's me again. So, it's working. For those of you who are interested in seeing Dr. Green's slide, they are in the program app under his session. And because we were streaming live the session, the video will be available on our YouTube channel after. So please make sure, so we'll share the information again in the program app, but yes, you can have access to both the slides and the whole session later. So just some quick reminders, and because this is what we do, So just a quick reminder that David and Dr. Dominic Dilicarpini and myself are hosting a session today. Actually, it's at 4. It's session G2 and Mendeley 1 to talk about our edit collection based on the conference theme. So please, if you're interested, come see us and talk to us about your project. We'd love to hear from you. The cultural assessment presentation that we talked about yesterday, and it's in the program app and the program, is going to be right after this plenary, B5 in Casino Ballroom. Please go listen to what CWPA has been doing to change the culture and where to go from here. Tonight is the award ceremony at 6. This is a great opportunity to come celebrate all the winners, executive board members, outgoing, incoming. So please come and join us. We have mocktails and we have awards. And then I remind you again of what I said yesterday. Please, if you are here on Wednesday, please stay for the town hall in the morning. It will be right after breakfast, because we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to talk about where CWPA is right now and where we're thinking to go next, but we're not going to decide on that until we hear from you. So please come share your thoughts with us on Wednesday. Enjoy the rest of the conference and ask us any questions you may have. Thank you.